The rant is go!
When I try to project my thoughts forward into a future perspective of the modern generation of console gaming and think, what defines this generation? I have to postulate about what will continue past this gen into the future and discount all of those ideas that subsist as indicative of what defines this gen. That is to say, I think, what is happening now that will most likely die out next gen? Installs? Probably not. Optical formats are great for storing games, but not necessarily great for running them. Installs will probably get smaller going forward, though. DLC? Fuck no. That stuff is going to stick with us, if not evolve into an even larger creature. One thing that I believe has really kicked into high gear this gen, and will probably subside for the most part next gen, is the unresponsiveness of controls. Lag. I'm not talking online play lag. That's a harder problem to get rid of, and one where none of the people who actually want to fix it have the power to do so. This generation has marked the appearance of lag and unresponsiveness in a majority of the popular and/or AAA titles, which is caused by a number of factors that I'll discuss in this episode of The Rant is Go. Firstly, let's talk about the major point of this gen, HD. High-definition televisions were really just making it to the market slightly before 2005. Though there were HD CRT televisions, they were relatively unpopular by the time the 7th generation of consoles started, so we all started switching to LCDs, which were cheaper but featured a host of other issues. The pertinent issue being response times. Response time on a TV is the time it takes for the screen to react to a signal it receives and display it. This is a measurement of the lag induced by the screen itself, and when the 7th generation of consoles started, LCDs were, and still are to some extent, terrible when it comes to responsiveness. Though I could consider not accepting LCD's issues as indicative of this gen, it would be unfit, as LCD is the #1 type of TV gamers use due to its cheapness and lack of burn-in issues like plasma TVs had. So we headed into this gen with the knowledge that to get an HD image out of our new consoles, a bit of lag being added into the mix was necessary. Back then, it was never below 16 milliseconds on a TV and could be anywhere near as high as 36 milliseconds, depending on whether or not your new TV was a POS. Modern TVs are getting closer to a desirable number, such as 4 milliseconds on a good TV and 12 milliseconds on a bad one, so this problem is somewhat alleviated for LCD TVs going forward. Most people are currently gaming with TVs that are adding lag to their images. A single frame of video is equal to 16.33 repeating milliseconds, so at the beginning of this gen there was about 1 or 2 frames of lag during games. This lag of course would affect any type of game played. Before this gen, TVs really didn't add lag to video games, so this is definitely something prevalent during the 7th generation of consoles that is relatively fixed as we head into the next. The multi-core nature of modern consoles means that in order to take advantage of the hardware, the developer must be quite savvy at multi-threaded programming. There is a certain problem with this in that multiple software systems across cores must sync with each other in time to render the frame, and in a lot of cases this causes missed frames. As such, when designing a thorough, advanced, and meticulous setup for your AAA 7th gen game, you would much rather run at 30 frames per second than 60, because that will slightly more than double the amount of time you can spend processing your various systems, and you'll spend less time syncing them for each frame. There are game developers that cannot think of relevant or innovative uses for all the processing power in modern-day consoles, so they do the first natural thing to do with excess power: use it on graphics. Killzone 2 and 3 and Uncharted 2 and 3 are really good examples of this. They use some number of SPUs, I'm not sure how many each uses and I'm too lazy to look it up currently, to shade the image, which yields realistic results. The problem lies in that it is possible to create a graphics pipeline too long and add serious latency to a game, like Killzone 2, which accidentally did just that. Killzone 3 and the Uncharted games don't experience this problem, but there are many games that do. In the best case scenario, it's unnoticeable as anything more than the latency inherent to running a game at 30 frames per second instead of 60. The very nature of multi-core design, especially that of the cell processor, causes a need for syncing threads which, in the best case scenario, provides incentive to run at a locked 30 frames per second, adding only slight latency. In the worst case scenario, though, it runs at 30 frames per second and adds an intentional and locked latency to the pipeline to produce all sorts of shiny graphics. The next generation of video game consoles, Wii U excluded, will probably outperform the current so much that the graphical ceiling and processor potential will be too high to reach for an even higher percentage of games coming to the market when compared to this gen. As such, it's very likely that practices like pipelining deeply across the processor cores for extra graphical polish will largely cease when we hit the next gen. As I mentioned previously, the higher graphical ceiling will bring much more potential to the developers than many of them have the budget to fully utilize. As such, it will mitigate the need to reduce frame rate in order to increase graphical fidelity. It is my expectation that we will see a lot more games running at 60 frames per second in the 8th gen because the processors will be potent enough to not need as much time for the processes. This, of course, doesn't apply equally to all genres, as some, such as Western RPGs or zombie murder porn simulators, generally run at poor frame rates due to the open nature of their gameplay design. In such cases, I expect a massive improvement from this gen in latency and frame rate, but by no means should anyone expect these types of games to run at 60 frames per second next gen. It's just not sensible. Either way, a majority of games aren't openly designed when it comes to gameplay, so the demands on the graphics engine and the hardware are much more predictable. Predictability means the demand on the engine is much more uniform and custom-tailored to fit the engine's abilities. Between raising the ceiling on graphical capability so much and the fact that having an easily programmable platform is definitely becoming more in vogue, with PC and iOS being really popular platforms for indie devs, and the Vita courting the same market both literally and in design, it is likely the design of next-gen consoles and the shift in the games market we're going to experience going into it will cause a much higher percentage of games to run at 60 frames per second compared to the 7th generation of consoles. So, in all of those sections, I explained why this generation in particular caused latency to become a real issue. Worst case scenarios like GTA 4 have a lag of around 166 milliseconds, or about 10 frames of lag, which really affects gameplay, but most games only add somewhere around 4 to 7 frames of lag. As we head into the next generation, I pray that this era of lag will end. It seems likely because of the higher graphical ceiling of the next gen and the fact that I fully expect Sony, and hopefully others, to start allowing and enticing more indie developers and lower-end games onto the market via loosening up the TRC, lowering the cost of SDKs, and having a more desirable platform via sales figures. Remember that, Sony? Yeah, me too. Me too. Sure, there will always be our Killzones, Uncharted's, and Gears of War's, but for the majority of games, I expect 60 frames per second to really come back into vogue. Hopefully this pans out because there's no reason why gameplay and responsiveness should take back seat to graphics anymore past this generation. I hope you enjoyed this video. This is Dan from Gigaboots.com telling you that I'm a smart fucking guy with a cool website, so you should go there and watch our damn videos.